Let's make the lo-fi keys from Kill Bill by SZA without any external plugins. You can download this preset along with over 175 other useful presets in my pack called Sounds You Know. A link for that's in the description. To get started, initialize preset, I'm going to be using the basic shapes from Factory. Then I'm going to use the second keyframe here, which is this flattened out sine wave. And I can edit that by clicking this pencil icon here and going to the wavetable editor. Then click on the second keyframe here to edit the second keyframe. So what I'm starting with is the first odd harmonics, the first three odd ordered harmonics. So I got the first harmonic here, the third harmonic here, and the fifth harmonic there. Now what I'm going to do is add in the second and fourth harmonics, and I'm going to match their volume to this last fifth harmonic here. So I'm just going to click where the fourth harmonic would be, drag up until I get to that amplitude here, and then same thing for the second harmonic. And you should get something like this. Now that I'm done with that, I'm going to click this X icon to go back, and I'm going to open up oscillator 2. So for oscillator 2, I'm also going to be using basic shapes, but this time it's just going to be a sine wave. I'm also going to turn up the volume for this one. So I'm going to turn up it just slightly to 0.518. I'm also going to turn down phase randomization for both of these to avoid any phasing issues. So now that I've done that, let's open up sample. And I'm going to load in a custom sample for this, but I'll tell you how I made it. So this is 7 kilohertz white noise, and what that means is I just ran some white noise through a bandpass filter. The cutoff of that filter was at 7 kilohertz, and I just bounced about 2 or 3 seconds of that noise, and then I put it in my sample folder for Vital. And you can find that sample folder if you go to User here, and you right-click on any of those samples. You can click Open File Location. So you can just drag your new bounced sample into that folder and access it from Vital. So anyways, I'm going to use this noise here as a modulator for oscillator 2, and it's going to modulate frequency. So I'm going to turn the volume all the way down on the sample, and then from oscillator 2, I'm going to click here, and I'm going to click FM from sample. Then I'm going to lower this amount to 16.667. So doing frequency modulation from this white noise here is going to create a high buzzing effect for oscillator 2. It kind of sounds like white noise itself. And it sounds like a bit much now, but we're going to tame it a lot with some filters later on. But before we do that, I'm going to edit the envelope just slightly. So I'm going to give it a little bit more of a pluck sound, and I'm going to set the sustain to 0.8. Then I'm going to drag on this point and increase the curvature there, so that now we have a little bit more amplitude at the beginning of the note. Maybe a little bit more curvature. That sounds good to me. Now that we've done that, let's add in our filters. So starting with filter 1, I'm going to set this to an analog 24 decibel filter. And then I'm going to route in oscillator 2 as well as oscillator 1. Now for this one, I'm going to set the resonance to about 20%. And I'm going to take the blend over here to 1 so that it's a bandpass filter. Then I'm going to set the cutoff here. So right now I have cutoff unit in hertz, and if you want to do that, you can go to advanced, and frequency units can be in semitones or hertz. By default, it's semitones, and sometimes that's not ideal, especially if you're not key tracking. You don't really care how far away from middle C you are, you might care more about the actual frequency range in hertz. So for this preset, that's what I did. And I'm going to right-click the cutoff here and set the cutoff to 2500. So now that I've done that, let's hear it before we add in that second filter. I'm pretty much only hearing the noise. I'm going to go up 1 octave. and I get a lot more of that tonality. So I'm going to increase the volume just a little bit. That's a little better. And now I'm going to add in filter 2, and that's going to help even more. So for filter 2, I'm going to set this to dirty 24 decibel. And we're going to get quite a bit of distortion from this filter. So this one, I'm going to just route in the result of filter 1. I'm going to set the drive to 4. And then for cutoff, let's set this to 3037. Then I'm going to lower resonance all the way down to 0. And now let's hear this. So that takes out a lot of the highs that we're getting from the frequency modulation from this white noise here. And we're also getting some drive. And I think it's important for a key sound like this to get some of that drive in one of these filters, because if I get all the drive in the effects, it's a little hard to predict because you might be playing one note or you might be playing several notes. And if you're playing several notes, it's going to be louder. And the distortion can really get out of hand when you're playing thicker chords. Now, some of that sounds good, and we are going to use some distortion in the effects here. But we're getting a lot of distortion, even with just this 4 decibel right here, because this dirty filter has a lot of distortion by default. So before we move on, let's talk about making a sound lo-fi. Right now we've accomplished making it sound lo-fi about halfway. We've put in this bandpass filter, which kind of makes it sound like it's playing on old equipment. Think about an old speaker. It's not going to be able to play some of those low frequencies and the high frequencies, and it's going to have a little resonant bump wherever those frequencies resonate within that device. Think about like an old radio or something like that. And then we're getting some of that hiss that you'd get from especially like an old tape by using the frequency modulation from this sample here. But it sounds a little bit too clean right now. It's too consistent, but an old tape will have some wearing, and you'll get some wobbling and you'll get some jittering as well. So in order to accomplish that, we're going to use some of these LFOs. So let's add in a slow wobble. To do that, I'm going to use LFO 1, and I'm going to set it to a sine wave, or just click this thing to make it curved. And then I'm going to change the unit of the tempo here to seconds, so it's not dependent on our tempo. Then I'm going to set this to 0.8 seconds. And then I'm going to use LFO 1 to modulate the fine tuning of both oscillators 1 and 2. And then I'm going to make it bipolar by holding shift and then dragging it over. And I want to control that wobble with a macro. So I'm going to drag macro 1 over to both of those amounts. And then I'm going to set macro 1 to 0.2. And let's hear that. So now you'll hear it going up and down in pitch. I'm going to label this slow wobble. And then I'm also going to add in a more jittery, faster wobble. And in order to do that, I'm going to use random 1 here. So for random, I'm going to set this to seconds as well for the frequency. And then on the random, I'm going to set this to 0.06 seconds. So it's quite fast. And then I'm going to use this to modulate fine pitch as well. So I'm going to hold shift to make it bipolar, drag that over to the fine pitch of both oscillators. And then same thing for this, I want to control that jitter with macro 2. So I'm going to drag over macro 2. Once again, I'm going to set this to 0.2. And then I'm going to set this macro, I'm going to label it jitter. So now let's hear that. So that's adding quite a bit of instability to the sound, making it kind of sound like an old tape. But I'm going to take it a couple steps further. I'm going to use LFO 1 to also control the amplitude of oscillator 1. So I'm going to hold shift and drag this over to the level of oscillator 1. And then I'm going to drag over macro 3 to control that. and this will basically just be tremolo. For the tremolo, let's set this to 0.4. Let's hear that. So now you'll hear it go up and down in pitch, and while it does, it's going up and down in volume as well. I'm not doing that to oscillator 2 because I want that noise to be relatively consistent in volume. So now that I've done that, one more step, I'm going to add in some instability, some of that jitteriness to the noise. And I'm going to do it through oscillator 2. So in order to do that, I'm going to set this to formant scale. And then I'm going to drag over random 1 over to the formant scale here. But before I do, I'm going to hold shift to make it bipolar. And then for this one, I'm going to right click that modulation amount, and I'm going to set this to 0.18. And so basically what I'm doing here is adding in some randomness to the oscillator 2, which is being frequency modulated by this white noise, to give it even more jitteriness. So now that I've done that, now we can move on to some of the effects. So now let's navigate over to the effects section and let's add in a distortion. So keep in mind that this distortion is applying to all the notes that you're playing at a given time. And that could be 1 note or that could be 8 notes. Actually, I'm going to increase this to 10 notes. So it could be anywhere from 1 to 10 notes. And 1 note's going to be a lot quieter than 10 notes. And the amount of distortion is reliant on input gain. So input gain is how loud the signal is before the distortion. So basically, long story short, 1 note is going to be a lot less distorted than 10 notes. And I can demonstrate that for you. I'm going to set the drive to 15 decibels, and then I'm going to lower the volume here. And so here's what 1 note sounds like. First, I'm going to increase the transposition here by 12, so I'm playing in the upper register. Now that's not that distorted, but now if I play a chord, it's a lot louder, and so I'm getting a lot more distortion as a result. Now that doesn't apply to the filter distortion, because as you may recall, each note gets its own filter. So basically, the input gain is consistent. It's always that 1 note. So if I increase the drive here, if I play 1 note versus playing like 4 or 5 notes, it pretty much sounds the same. I'm not getting any more distortion because I'm playing more notes. So I'm going to return that drive for the filter back to 4 decibels. I'm going to go back to effects and turn on that distortion. And then I'm going to set the drive to 7.6 and then back down on the mix. So I'm going to use macro 4 to control the mix there. And I'm going to set macro 4 to 0.3. So my solution to that problem of inconsistent input gain is just to back off on the mix. So I'm never getting too much harsh distortion from this module here. So anyways, I'm also going to add in a pre-filter. This is going to help prevent the distortion from getting out of hand as well. And I'm going to set the cutoff of this filter to 2,295. So now let's hear this. I need to turn up the volume quite a bit. So now that I have that distortion, I'm going to add in a compressor. So I want the distortion first, then the compressor, and I'm going to set this to single band. And this is also going to give me a fair amount of distortion, and it's also going to be dependent on input gain as well, which is why I'm going to take the same approach of backing way down on the mix. So for this one, I'm going to set the threshold to about -17, and then I'm going to turn off this this thing right here by double clicking, and then I'm going to right click on the attack and set this to 25, and then for the release, I'm going to set this to 10. So now let's hear how much distortion this is adding. Now, especially if I play a chord, that's quite a bit of distortion. So I'm going to back down for the mix, only 0.15. So that just adds a little bit of crunch and helps tie the sound together a little bit more. So now we're almost done. We're going to add in an EQ and a reverb. So for the equalizer, I'm going to cut out some of the lows. So I'm going to click this left thing right here so I get a low shelf. And then I'm going to turn the resonance all the way down. For this one, I'm going to set the cutoff to 500 hertz. Then I'm going to add this little middle thing right here. I'm going to add a little bump. And I'm going to set that gain to 4.3. I'm going to set the resonance to 2. And then I'm going to set the cutoff here to 6,000. And now I get this. And now I'm going to add in a reverb. Now, this is optional. I was a little bit surprised to hear a reverb on the original, but it can kind of make it sound like there's this lo-fi device, like an old radio or something, playing in a modern environment. So for the reverb, I set the mix to 15, so it's pretty subtle. I set the size down to 40, and I set the time to 1.5. So now all together. Now I got one more task to do, and that's labeling this macro. I'm going to call this post distortion. Now a couple of really important details before I finish, a couple things that I forgot. In my original sound, I transposed the sample down 3 semitones. I also moved these oscillators up 24 semitones, or 2 octaves, instead of using this advanced thing where I can transpose the whole preset up 1 octave. So keep this one at 0, set these to 24, and then set the sample down 3 semitones. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.